The morning air at Joint Base Lewis McChord carried the sharp bite of Washington winter, cold enough to sting exposed skin, but not quite cold enough to frost the training grounds. Captain Raina Caldwell stood at parade rest near the equipment staging area, her desert tan boots planted firmly on the packed earth. They were older boots, worn at the heels and creased across the toes in patterns that spoke of miles walked and mountains climbed. She'd resoled them twice, unwilling to break in a new pair when these knew her feet so well. Around her, the joint training exercise was assembling into organized chaos. Marines from her combat engineer unit checked demolitions equipment and surveying tools. An Army Ranger platoon verified communications gear, and dominating the center of the staging area like peacocks in full display, a SEAL reconnaissance unit moved with the casual arrogance of men who believed they owned every space they entered. Lieutenant Commander Brock Halverson led them, his voice carrying across the morning air with practice projection. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of sharp-featured face that photographs well in recruiting materials. His team moved around him with synchronized efficiency, their movements speaking to hundreds of hours of training together. Raina watched them with the same calm attention she gave to everything, her dark eyes tracking patterns and noting details. The SEALs were good. She could see that immediately. Their weapons handling was flawless, their communication crisp and minimal. But there was something else in their bearing, too, something that made her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. It was the way Halverson's gaze had swept past her and the 3 other female Marines in the formation earlier, dismissing them as thoroughly as if they'd been invisible. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've seen how small-town skills can surprise people in your area. Colonel Wade Thornton emerged from the command tent, his weathered face creased with the permanent squint of a man who'd spent decades in the sun. He carried himself with the solid presence of old oak, unmovable and deeply rooted. When he spoke, people listened not because he raised his voice, but because he rarely wasted words. The colonel wants everyone assembled for the operations briefing, Staff Sergeant Iris Ketterman said quietly, appearing at Raina's shoulder. Iris was compact and fierce, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen her already angular features. She'd been with Raina through 2 deployments, and they developed the kind of wordless communication that came from trusting someone with your life. Raina nodded and fell in a step beside her as the units began moving toward the briefing area. The SEALs were already there, of course, claiming the front positions with the territorial certainty of apex predators. Halverson stood with his arms crossed, his stance radiating impatience even in stillness. The exercise scenario was ambitious. Colonel Thornton began, without preamble, pulling up a topographical map on the display screen. His finger traced a route through mountainous terrain that made several of the assembled soldiers shift their weight. We're simulating a high-value target interdiction in remote hostile territory. Multiple objectives, challenging terrain, and conditions designed to push every specialty to its limits. Raina studied the map with the focused attention that had become second nature. The elevation changes were severe, the approach routes limited. Her mind automatically began calculating demolition points for route denial, structural weaknesses in the simulated enemy positions. This was what she'd trained for, what she was good at. The fact that some of the men in this formation didn't believe that was their problem, not hers. We'll be incorporating long-range reconnaissance, direct action elements, engineering obstacles, and combat support components, the colonel continued. Each unit will face scenarios designed for their specialty, but you'll need to work together. This isn't a competition between branches. His eyes moved deliberately across the formation, lingering just a moment longer on Halverson's group. The message was clear enough that even Raina, standing 20 feet back, caught the subtext. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, detailing logistics and communication protocols. Raina listened with half her attention while the other half wandered to other things. The way the wind was moving across the field, steady from the northwest with periodic gusts. The quality of light filtering through the morning clouds, That particular gray-white that meant the weather would hold clear but cold. Small details that most people never noticed, but that could mean everything in the field. When the briefing broke, the SEALs clustered together immediately, their voices low, but their body language excluding everyone else as effectively as a locked door. Halverson's laugh carried across the dispersing crowd, sharp and performative. Reyna turned to help Iris inventory their engineering equipment, her hands moving through the familiar ritual of checking charges and timing devices. She was aware, peripherally, of Halverson's team moving closer, their boots crunching on gravel. "So we got combat engineers on this one," Halverson said, his voice pitched to Carrie. His team arranged themselves behind him like a chorus prepared for their cue. "That's interesting. I didn't realize we needed someone to build sandcastles in the mountains." The laughter came on command, sharp and exclusive. Reyna didn't look up from her equipment check, her fingers steady as she verified detonator connections. Beside her, Iris had gone very still, the kind of stillness that preceded explosive movement. "Easy," Reyna murmured, just loud enough for a friend to hear. "Not worth it." But Halverson wasn't finished. He'd found an audience and was warming to his performance. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across their equipment cases. "I see they're assigning women to combat roles now," he said, his tone suggesting he was commenting on an interesting but ultimately misguided social experiment. "That's very progressive, very modern." Reyna straightened slowly, meeting his eyes with the same calm expression she'd worn throughout the morning. Her face gave away nothing, revealed no anger or hurt or defensive posture. She simply looked at him with the patient attention of someone waiting for a child to finish a tantrum. "Is there something specific you need, sir?" she asked, her voice level and professional. "Or are you just sharing observations?" The question, delivered without inflection or challenge, seemed to catch him off balance for just a moment. Then his smile sharpened into something harder. "Just making conversation, Captain. Trying to build unit cohesion. Isn't that what they teach in those leadership courses?" Reyna held his gaze for one more moment, then turned back to her equipment with deliberate dismissal. Behind Halverson, one of his team members shifted uncomfortably, but the lieutenant commander was already moving away, his point apparently made to his satisfaction. Iris exhaled slowly through her nose. "One day," she said quietly, "someone's going to teach that man some humility." Reyna secured the last equipment case and stood, brushing dust from her uniform. "Maybe," she said, "but it won't be today, and it won't be because someone lost their temper." She didn't add what she was thinking, didn't mention the way her fingers had automatically assessed the wind or the way her eyes had measured distances across the training ground. Some things were better kept quiet. Some lessons were better taught through demonstration than declaration. The morning sun climbed higher, burning through the last of the morning mist. Somewhere in the mountains ahead, the training scenarios waited. And Captain Reyna Caldwell, with her worn boots and quiet competence, prepared to face them with the same steady patience her grandfather had taught her on a Montana ranch, when the world was wide and the targets were far, and the only voice that mattered was the wind. The operations tent smelled of canvas and coffee, that particular military combination of fabric stretched tight against weather and caffeine consumed in quantities that would alarm civilian doctors. Maps covered every available surface, marked with colored pins and grease pencil notations that tracked imaginary enemy positions and friendly force movements. Colonel Thornton stood at the center of it all like a lighthouse in fog, solid and unmoved by the currents swirling around him. The specialized training scenarios would begin after lunch, he announced, his finger tracing routes on the largest topographical map. Each unit will face challenges specific to their operational expertise. He paused, his weathered eyes scanning the assembled leadership. "We're also incorporating an experimental element into this exercise. Long-range precision engagement at distances that push the boundaries of current operational capability." Reyna stood near the back with the other engineer officers, her attention focused completely on the colonel's briefing. Long-range precision meant sniper operations, probably something ambitious given the experimental designation. She felt the familiar tingle of interest that came whenever complex problems presented themselves, though she kept her expression neutral and professional. We'll be testing the Barrett M107A1 at extended ranges, Thornton continued. The training scenario involves a simulated high-value target at a distance of 2,950 meters. The goal is to evaluate both equipment capability and shooter adaptability under challenging field conditions. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. Nearly 3,000 meters was an extraordinary distance, the kind of shot that required not just skill, but almost perfect conditions and a thorough understanding of ballistics that went beyond standard training. Reyna's mind immediately began calculating the variables involved. Wind drift at that distance would be measured in meters, not inches. The bullet drop would be extreme. Even the rotation of the Earth would need to be factored into the calculations. Lieutenant Commander Halverson stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who believed every room awaited his input. My team has extensive experience with long-range precision work, sir. We'd be honored to demonstrate SEAL capabilities in this scenario. Thornton's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd been expecting exactly this response. That's noted, Commander. However, this is a joint training exercise. We'll be offering the opportunity across all participating units. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Reyna saw Halverson's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He wasn't accustomed to not being handed the spotlight immediately. Around him, his team maintained their carefully neutral expressions, but the tension was visible in the set of their shoulders. In fact, Thornton continued, his voice taking on a tone that Reyna had learned meant he was about to do something deliberately provocative. I think it would be valuable to demonstrate that precision shooting capability exists across all military occupational specialties. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the room and landing, with apparent casualness, on Reyna. Captain Caldwell, you're a combat engineer. Have you had any experience with long-range weapon systems? The question dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and Reyna felt I turned toward her. She kept her expression calm, though her mind was racing through the implications of the question. Thornton knew her service record, knew exactly what training she'd received. This was deliberate, though she couldn't yet see the full shape of what he was building toward. Standard qualifications, sir, she replied evenly. Nothing specialized beyond basic combat requirements. It wasn't technically a lie. Her official military training hadn't included advanced sniper schools or specialized long-range courses. What she didn't mention was the decade of informal training that had started when she was 12 years old, standing on a Montana hillside while her grandfather taught her to read wind like other children read books. Thornton nodded slowly, as if considering this information for the first time. Well, he said, perhaps this would be an interesting learning opportunity. The point of the exercise is to push boundaries and challenge assumptions about capability. Halverson's laugh cut across the tent, sharp and dismissive. With all due respect, sir, long-range precision shooting isn't something you learn on the job. It requires years of specialized training and experience. He gestured toward Reyna without quite looking at her directly. I'm sure Captain Caldwell is excellent at her actual job, but putting an untrained shooter on a weapon system like the Barrett would be irresponsible at best, dangerous at worst. Several of his team members nodded in agreement, their expressions suggesting they were being generous by even entertaining the absurdity of the suggestion. One of them, a lean chief petty officer whose name tape read Frost, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Dangerous to whom? Thornton asked mildly. It's a training exercise with proper range safety protocols. The worst outcome is a missed shot and some wasted ammunition. Sir, Halverson pressed, clearly convinced he was preventing an embarrassment for everyone involved. The Barrett M107A1 is a specialized weapon system. You can't just hand it to someone without extensive training and expect results. It would undermine the credibility of the entire exercise. Reyna remained silent, watching the exchange with the same calm attention she'd given to everything else that morning. She was aware of Iris standing beside her, vibrating with barely suppressed fury. She was aware of the other Marines and soldiers in the tent, some looking uncomfortable, others curious about where this confrontation was heading. "Tell you what, Commander," Thornton said, his voice still carrying that deceptively mild tone. "Why don't we let Captain Caldwell decide if she's interested in participating? This is voluntary, after all. No one's being ordered to attempt something beyond their capability." He turned to face Raina fully, and she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like challenge, or perhaps invitation. What she didn't see was doubt. "Captain, would you be interested in attempting the long-range scenario? Purely as a learning experience, of course. No pressure to succeed, no judgment if you decline." The tent had gone completely silent. Raina could hear the wind pushing against the canvas walls, could smell the coffee going bitter in someone's forgotten mug. Every person in the room was waiting for her response, most of them probably expecting her to politely decline, to acknowledge the sensible limits of her training and experience. She thought about her grandfather, about the first time he'd let her hold his championship rifle. It had been almost too heavy for her 12-year-old arms, but he'd shown her how to balance it, how to let the earth support its weight. "You don't force the rifle, Raina girl," he'd said in that patient drawl of his. "You become part of the system. You, the rifle, the wind, the target. All one thing." She thought about the years of practice that followed, the countless hours on the ranch learning to read conditions that most people never noticed existed. The way wind moved differently at different elevations, the way temperature and humidity changed bullet flight, the way patience was more important than speed when the target was far enough away that the bullet would take seconds to arrive. She thought about every assumption Halverson had made about her based on her gender and her military specialty, every dismissive glance and condescending comment. And she thought about how some lessons were better taught through demonstration than declaration. "I'd be interested in participating, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear in the silent tent. "If there's a spot available in the training schedule." Halverson's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on something between disbelief and satisfaction. He thought she was walking into humiliation, she realized. He thought this would prove his point more effectively than any argument could. "Excellent," Thornton said, and there might have been the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "We'll convoy to the range after lunch. Bring appropriate cold weather gear. It's going to be a long afternoon in the mountains." The briefing broke up with the usual organized chaos of military operations transitioning to action. Raina gathered her notes and turned to leave, aware of the conversations starting up around her, the speculation and the assumptions. Iris caught her arm as they walked out into the cold morning air. "Please tell me you know what you're doing," Iris said quietly, her dark eyes searching Raina's face. "Please tell me this isn't just pride or anger making you do something reckless." Raina looked at her friend, at the genuine concern in her expression, and allowed herself a small smile. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. "Trust me." Behind them, she could hear Halverson's voice carrying on the wind, already taking bets with his team on how spectacularly she would fail. The numbers being thrown around suggested they expected her to miss the target by hundreds of meters if she managed to hit anywhere near the proper range at all. Raina pulled her worn jacket tighter against the cold and headed toward the equipment area to prepare. The mountains waited ahead, and somewhere in those mountains was a target at 2,950 meters. It was going to be an interesting afternoon indeed. The convoy rolled out at 1300 hours, a line of military vehicles winding through the foothills like a mechanical serpent. Raina sat in the back of a Humvee with Iris and 2 other Marines from her unit, watching the landscape change as they climbed higher into the mountains. The pine trees grew denser, their branches heavy with old snow that hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. The sky remained that peculiar gray-white that promised cold but not precipitation, the kind of weather that made your bones ache if you stayed still too long. In the vehicle ahead, she could see the SEALs through the rear window, their heads close together in conversation. Occasionally one would glance back toward her vehicle, and she didn't need to hear their words to know what they were discussing. The bets had apparently spread beyond Halverson's immediate team. She'd overheard figures being thrown around during lunch, speculation on whether she'd even be able to chamber a round properly, much less hit anywhere near the target area. "You're really calm about this," Iris observed, her voice pitched low enough that only Reyna could hear over the engine noise. "Either you're the coolest person I've ever met, or you're in complete denial about what's about to happen." Reyna kept her eyes on the passing landscape, watching the way the wind moved through the trees. It was steady from the northwest, gusting periodically, but with a rhythm to it. Predictable. That was good. "Maybe a little of both," she said quietly. Her hand rested on her thigh, fingers tapping out an unconscious rhythm that matched her breathing. It was an old habit from the ranch, something her grandfather had taught her to manage pre-shot nerves. "Breathe with the earth," he'd said. "Everything has a rhythm if you listen close enough." The range facility appeared after 40 minutes of climbing, a cleared area carved in the mountainside with firing positions at one end and target arrays scattered at various distances across the valley below. It was an impressive setup, clearly designed for exactly this kind of extreme range training. Range safety personnel were already present, along with spotters and a collection of high-powered optics for observation. Colonel Thornton's vehicle arrived first, and he stepped out with the same unhurried deliberation he brought to everything. The range officer, a weathered Army sergeant major whose name tape read Kovacs, approached with a tablet full of safety briefings and equipment checklists. Behind them, Halverson's team piled out of their vehicles with the easy confidence of men who expected to dominate whatever came next. The Barrett M107A1 waited on an equipment table near the primary firing position, looking exactly like what it was, a precision instrument designed to deliver half-inch diameter projectiles across distances that would have been considered impossible a generation ago. The rifle was massive, nearly 5 feet long, and weighing close to 30 pounds fully loaded. Its muzzle brake was designed to tame recoil that could break an unprepared shooter's collarbone. Even unloaded and inert on the table, it commanded respect. Reyna approached the weapon with careful attention, her eyes taking in every detail. The scope was a high-end Leupold, properly mounted and zeroed according to the data card attached to the rifle. The bipod was extended and adjusted for the firing position that had been prepared. Someone had maintained this weapon with care. She could see that in the cleanliness of the action and the smooth operation of the bolt. "Impressive-looking weapon, isn't it?" Halverson said, appearing at her shoulder with the studied casualness of someone who'd timed his arrival for maximum audience. "Lot different from the M4 you're probably used to. This isn't something you just pick up and shoot. The recoil alone will knock you around if you're not prepared for it." He reached past her to tap the massive muzzle brake with one finger, a gesture of casual ownership. "My boys train for months before they're even allowed to touch one of these in a live fire scenario. It's not a matter of courage or determination. It's physics and biomechanics. Someone your size," his eyes flicked over her frame with unconcealed assessment, "is going to have a hard time managing the weapon system properly." Reyna stepped back slightly, giving him room to continue his lecture. She learned long ago that men like Halverson needed to talk themselves through their own superiority before they could move on to other topics. Around them, his team had gathered in a loose semicircle, along with Marines and soldiers from the other units. Word had spread during the convoy, and now she had an audience of at least 40 people, most of them probably expecting to witness exactly the failure Halverson was describing. "The range goes cold," Sergeant Major Kovacs called out, his voice carrying across the facility with parade ground authority. "All personnel behind the safety line. Shooters and spotters to the briefing area." The briefing was technical and thorough, exactly what Reyna would have expected from a range professional. Kovacs outlined the safety protocols, the communication procedures, the wind conditions that had been recorded throughout the morning. The target was located at a surveyed distance of 2,950 meters, elevation difference of approximately 120 meters above the firing position, current wind averaging 8 to 12 miles per hour from the northwest with gusts to 15. Reyna listened while simultaneously running calculations in her head. The bullet would drop roughly 250 feet over that distance, arriving at the target almost 4 full seconds after leaving the barrel. The wind drift would push it several meters to the side. The Coriolis effect, The actual rotation of the Earth during the bullet's flight would need to be factored in. She could feel the numbers arranging themselves in her mind, like puzzle pieces finding their proper places. "Captain Caldwell, you'll be shooting first," Thornton announced, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was enjoying this more than his professional demeanor indicated. "Chief Petty Officer Frost will serve as your spotter, since you don't have a dedicated partner for this evolution." Frost looked surprised, but moved forward with professional composure. He was the SEAL who'd seemed uncomfortable earlier during Halverson's commentary, and up close Reyna could see intelligence in his eyes that suggested he might be more thoughtful than his teammates. "Ma'am," he said quietly, offering a slight nod that might have been respect or might have been pity. "Thank you, Chief," Reyna replied evenly. "I appreciate your assistance." She moved to the firing position, settling behind the Barrett with movements that were more practiced than anyone watching probably expected. Her body remembered the stance, even though it had been months since she'd held a rifle of this size. She adjusted the bipod slightly, tested the trigger pull, checked the scope alignment. Behind her, she could hear Halverson's voice carrying on the wind, though she tuned out the specific words. They didn't matter. Only the shot mattered. The wind gusted across the range, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Reyna closed her eyes for just a moment and let herself remember. Not the Marine Corps training ranges, but a different place and time. A Montana hillside with grass turning gold in late summer. Her grandfather's patient voice explaining how wind moved differently at different elevations, how you could read it in the grass and the trees and the dust if you knew what to look for. The way he taught her to become part of the system, to stop thinking of herself as separate from the rifle and the target and start thinking of it all as one continuous thing. "Wind check," she said quietly to Frost, opening her eyes and settling into position. The rifle felt heavy and solid against her shoulder, its weight grounding her into the earth. Frost raised his spotting scope, taking a moment to read the mirage and vegetation movement downrange. 8 to 10 miles per hour, northwest. Gusting to 12, he reported, his voice professional and clear. "Target is visible. Elevation 120 meters above our position." Reyna made minute adjustments to the scope, her fingers moving with practiced precision. She was aware of the silence that had fallen over the range, aware of 40 pairs of eyes watching her every movement. She was aware of Halverson's certainty that she would fail, of Thornton's quiet confidence, of Iris's worried hope. But mostly she was aware of the wind and the distance and the rifle and the way they all connected into a single problem with a single solution. "Ready when you are," Captain Kovacs called from the safety position. Reyna settled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow into the familiar pre-shot rhythm. The wind gusted once, twice, then settled into a steadier pattern. She could see it in the way the grass moved at various distances, could read the air like her grandfather had taught her all those years ago. "Preparing to fire," she said calmly, and pulled the rifle tight into her shoulder, her finger finding the trigger with gentle certainty. The world narrowed to wind and distance, and the small circle of her scope's reticle pointing toward a target almost 2 miles away. Behind her, some in the crowd shifted their weight. The sound seemed very loud in the mountain stillness. And then there was only silence and waiting and the patient certainty that came from 10,000 hours of practice that no one here knew she'd completed. The first thing most people got wrong about long-range shooting was thinking it was about the rifle. They focused on the equipment, on the ballistics tables and the specifications, on the mechanical precision of the weapon system itself. But Reyna's grandfather had taught her differently. The rifle is just the tool, he'd said during one of their early sessions on the ranch. You're the weapon. Your mind, your patience, your ability to read what the world is telling you. The rifle just delivers your decision. She lay behind the Barrett now, feeling its weight settle into the earth through the bipod, feeling the way the stock fit against her shoulder. Her breathing had slowed automatically, falling into the rhythm she'd practiced 10,000 times. 4 counts in, hold for 2, 6 counts out. It wasn't the breathing they taught in basic rifle marksmanship. It was something older, something her grandfather had learned from his grandfather, passed down through generations of Montana shooters who'd learned to take game at distances that seemed impossible. Target acquired, Frost said beside her, his voice quiet and professional. Range 2950 meters. Elevation 120 meters. Wind northwest at 10, gusting to 12. Raina made a small adjustment to the scope, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory rather than conscious thought. She was calculating, but not with the front of her mind. That part was quiet, observing. The calculations happened somewhere deeper, in a place where years of experience had compressed into instant recognition. The wind was the key, it always was. At 3,000 meters, the bullet would be in flight for nearly 4 seconds, and during that time the wind would be pushing it constantly. But wind wasn't uniform. It moved differently at different elevations, affected by terrain and temperature and a dozen other factors that most people never even considered. You had to read the entire column of air between you and the target, had to understand how the bullet would drift through each layer. She watched the grass move at various distances downrange. Close in, it bent sharply to the east, indicating the full force of the northwest wind. But farther out, maybe 1,000 meters, the movement was different, more erratic. There was terrain there, a ridgeline that would create turbulence. Beyond that, the grass moved steadily again, but the angle was slightly different. The wind was rotating as it traveled down the valley. "How's the mirage?" she asked Frost, still watching through her scope. There was a pause, and she could sense his surprise at the question. Most shooters at her supposed experience level wouldn't know to ask about mirage, wouldn't understand how heat shimmer could indicate wind direction and velocity. Boiling slightly, he replied after a moment. Running left to right at about 600 meters, then straightening out beyond that. Raina nodded slightly, filing the information away. The mirage confirmed what the grass was telling her. The wind was doing something complex in the middle distance, but it was more consistent beyond that point. She needed to account for the early drift, then the correction, then the steady push in the final third of the flight. Behind them, someone coughed. The sound seemed very loud in the mountain stillness, and Raina heard the whispers starting up again. They were wondering what was taking so long, probably thinking she was nervous or unsure. Let them think it. Patience was as important as any other factor in this equation. Atmosphere is everything, her grandfather had told her once, when she was maybe 14 and frustrated with a string of misses at 1,200 yards. You're not shooting through empty space, Raina girl. You're shooting through an ocean of air, and that ocean has currents and tides, just like water does. You have to learn to swim in it, to feel it, to predict it. She'd spent years learning to swim in that invisible ocean, learning to feel barometric pressure in her sinuses, to taste humidity in the air, to see temperature in the way light bent. The fancy equipment helped, the ballistic calculators and wind meters and rangefinders. But in the end, it all came down to whether you could synthesize all that information into a single decision, a single moment of commitment when you believed the shot was right. "You taking a nap up there, Captain?" Halverson called from somewhere behind the safety line. His voice carried amusement and satisfaction. "It's okay to admit this might be beyond your capability. No shame in stepping aside and letting someone qualified take the shot." Raina didn't respond, didn't even register the comment beyond a distant awareness that someone had spoken. She was in the zone now, that place where everything else fell away except the problem in front of her. The target was a steel silhouette, barely visible even through the high-powered scope. At this distance, it looked like a toy, something impossibly small and far away. Her mind automatically converted it to angular measurements, to the relationship between the reticle and the target size. "Chief," she said quietly, "give me a wind call in 30 seconds. "Roger," Frost replied, and she heard the professional competence in his voice sharpen. He was starting to realize something, she thought. Starting to understand that maybe this wasn't going to go the way everyone expected. She watched the wind patterns, timing them. There was a rhythm to the gusts, a pattern that repeated every 40 to 50 seconds. If she could time the shot between gusts, During one of those windows when the wind steadied into its base velocity, she could eliminate one major variable. Not remove it entirely. Wind was never truly steady, but reduce its impact. The seconds ticked by in her head, marked not by a watch, but by her breathing, by her heartbeat, by the ancient timing mechanism that good shooters developed after years of practice. She felt the wind gust, felt it settle, felt the pattern completing its cycle. "Wind call," she said softly. 8 miles per hour, northwest. Frost reported immediately. "Steady. No gusts currently." Reyna's finger found the trigger, that perfect point of contact that separated intention from action. The first pressure took up the slack, familiar and precise. She could feel the trigger's break point waiting just beyond, could feel the entire mechanical system of the rifle poised and ready. But she didn't fire. Not yet. Because there was one more factor, one more element that separated good shooters from great ones. You had to believe the shot. Not hope it would work, not think it might work. You had to know it with the same certainty you knew your own name. And if you didn't feel that certainty, you didn't pull the trigger. You waited, even if waiting meant never taking a shot at all. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, from a day when she'd rushed a shot and missed badly. "The target will always be there," he'd said gently, "but the right moment comes and goes." You have to learn the difference between patience and hesitation. Patience is waiting for the right moment. Hesitation is fear dressed up as caution. This was patience, not hesitation. She could feel it. The wind was right. The timing was right. Her breathing was right. The entire system had aligned into that perfect moment when everything came together. She could see the shot in her mind, could trace the bullet's path through the air, could see it arriving at the target with certainty. "Sending," she said calmly, and the world compressed into a single point of focus. Her finger completed the trigger press with smooth inevitability, no jerk or flinch or anticipation. The rifle's report was massive, a concussive blast that rolled across the valley like thunder. The recoil drove back into her shoulder with tremendous force, exactly as she'd been expecting, exactly as she'd prepared for. The Barrett's muzzle brake did its job, redirecting the gases and taming what would otherwise be punishing recoil, but it was still substantial, still demanded respect. The scope had lifted off target with the recoil, standard for any rifle of this power. By the time Reyna recovered and found the target again, the bullet had already left, was already traveling its long arc through the mountain air. 3.8 seconds of flight time at this distance, her mind supplied automatically. 3.8 seconds during which physics and atmosphere and every calculation she'd made would either prove correct or prove insufficient. Behind her, the range had gone completely silent. 40 people held their collective breath, all eyes on spotting scopes and binoculars, all attention focused downrange on a target almost 2 miles away. Even Halverson had stopped talking, caught up despite himself in the tension of the moment. Frost had his eye pressed to his spotting scope, tracking, waiting. Reyna stayed in position, watching through her own scope, her breathing already resettled into its steady rhythm. She didn't need to watch to know what was coming. She'd felt the shot leave, felt it in that way that experienced shooters understood, but could never quite explain. She knew. The seconds stretched out, time becoming elastic in that peculiar way it did when everything hung in balance. And then, at the very edge of visibility, she saw the impact. "Hit," Frost said, his voice cutting through the silence with sharp clarity. "Center mass." The words hung in the mountain air for a fraction of a second before the range erupted. Not with celebration, not yet, but with a collective sound of disbelief, a noise that was part gasp and part confusion, as if 40 people simultaneously tried to reconcile what they'd just witnessed with what they'd expected to see. "Confirm impact," Sergeant Major Kovacs barked, his professional discipline overriding his own surprise. He had his binoculars up, sweeping the target area with practiced efficiency. Visual confirmation. Center mass hit on primary target. Distance 2950 meters. The silence that followed was different from the one before. This wasn't anticipation. This was shock, pure and simple. Raina remained in position behind Barrett, her breathing still steady, her mind already running through the shot sequence to catalog what had worked and what could be improved next time. It was an automatic process, one her grandfather had drilled into her until it became as natural as breathing. Every shot teaches you something, he'd said, even the perfect ones. Someone started behind her, then stopped, apparently unable to finish the thought. Holy hell, another voice said quietly, and Raina recognized it as one of the Army Rangers who'd been vocally skeptical during lunch. She actually made the shot. Raina cleared the Barrett's action with smooth efficiency, extracting the spent casing and rendering the weapon safe. Her movements were practiced, professional, showing none of the triumph or relief she might have felt internally. She stood up from the firing position, stepping back from the line as protocol required, and only then did she turn to face the assembled crowd. Halverson stood frozen, perhaps 20 feet away, his expression cycling through stages of processing that would have been comical if the situation weren't so charged. His mouth was slightly open, his confident posture had collapsed into something more uncertain. Around him, his team looked similarly stunned, except for Frost, who was moving back from the spotting scope with something that might have been a suppressed smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Colonel Thornton stepped forward, his weathered face revealing nothing except perhaps the faintest glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Well shot, Captain," he said simply. "That's among the longest training shots I've personally witnessed." He turned to Kovacs. "Sergeant Major, I want full documentation of this for the training records. Range conditions, equipment specifications, everything." "Yes, sir," Kovacs replied, already making notes on his tablet. He glanced at Raina with undisguised reassessment. "Ma'am, I've been running this range for 12 years. That was extraordinary shooting." "Thank you, Sergeant Major," Raina said quietly. The rifle performed exactly as designed. It was a deflection, a way of acknowledging the compliment without claiming credit, and she saw Thornton's slight nod of approval. He understood what she was doing, maintaining the professional humility that was expected even in the face of exceptional performance. Iris had pushed through the crowd and now stood beside Raina, her dark eyes bright with vindication and something fiercer. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. The look she directed at Halverson spoke volumes without requiring words. "Captain Caldwell," Halverson finally managed, his voice tight and controlled in a way that suggested enormous effort. "Where exactly did you learn to shoot like that? Because that wasn't standard military training. That was something else entirely." It was a fair question, delivered without the mockery that had characterized his earlier comments. Raina considered him for a moment, weighing how much to reveal and how much to keep private. In the end, she decided that some explanation was owed, if only to prevent future assumptions and dismissals of other people's capabilities. "My grandfather taught me," she said simply. "Clayton Caldwell. He was a competitive long-range shooter in Montana, three-time national champion in the 1,000-yard discipline. I grew up on his ranch, and he started teaching me when I was 12 years old." The information dropped into the conversation like stones into water, creating ripples of understanding. Several of the older shooters in the crowd exchanged glances, and one of them, a grizzled Marine gunnery sergeant, let out a low whistle. "Clayton Caldwell," the gunny said with something like reverence. "I read about him. The man could make impossible shots look routine. They say he once took a coyote at 1,800 yards with a custom rifle he built himself. 1,940 meters, Raina corrected quietly. And it was prairie dog, not a coyote. He used to say that if you could hit a prairie dog at that distance, you could hit anything. She felt the memory rise unbidden. Summer days on the Montana plains, the grass golden and endless, the targets impossibly small even through the scope. Her grandfather's patient voice explaining wind and distance and all the invisible factors that separated hoping from knowing. The way he'd never pushed her, never demanded performance, but had simply shared his knowledge like a gift freely given. "So you've been shooting at this level since you were a child," Frost said, and there was no accusation in his tone, only curiosity. "Why didn't you mention it? Why let everyone assume you had no experience?" Raina met his eyes steadily. Because I didn't join the Marine Corps to be known as Clayton Caldwell's granddaughter, she said. I joined to serve as a combat engineer. That's my job. That's my specialty. That's what I trained for. The shooting was something I did before the military. It didn't seem relevant to my current duties. It was a simple answer, but it carried weight. Several people in the crowd nodded slowly, understanding the distinction she was making. She hadn't hidden her abilities out of deception. She'd simply chosen not to trade on skills that weren't part of her assigned role. Until today, Thornton said, and now he did smile slightly. When I asked you to participate in this exercise, you could have declined, Captain. You could have said you weren't comfortable attempting the shot. Yes, sir, Raina agreed. But you asked if I was interested in participating, not if I was qualified. And I was interested. The colonel's smile widened fractionally. That's what I thought. He turned to address the assembled crowd. Let this be a lesson about assumptions, people. Capability exists in unexpected places, in people we might overlook if we're not paying attention. Combat effectiveness isn't about credentials or stereotypes. It's about actual performance under pressure. His eyes moved deliberately to Halverson, and the message was clear enough that even the most obtuse observer couldn't miss it. The SEAL commander's face had gone from shock to something more complex, a mixture of embarrassment and grudging respect fighting for dominance. Commander Halverson, Thornton continued, would you like to attempt the shot as well? I believe that was your original intention, to demonstrate SEAL capabilities at extended range. It was both an invitation and a challenge, and everyone present recognized it as such. Halverson straightened slightly, some of his earlier confidence returning. The target was still there. The conditions hadn't changed substantially. If he made the shot, he could recover some of the ground he'd lost. If he missed, well, at least he'd have the excuse that the shot was genuinely difficult. Yes, sir, Halverson said firmly. I'd be honored to attempt it. He moved to the firing position with the careful precision of someone very aware that he was being watched and judged. Raina stepped further back, giving him space and removing herself from the center of attention. Iris moved with her, their shoulders nearly touching in that unconscious way that friends position themselves when silent support was needed. Frost returned to the spotting position without being asked, and Raina saw Halverson's jaw tighten slightly at the implicit reminder that his own man had just assisted the person who'd upstaged him. The SEAL commander settled behind the Barrett, taking considerably longer than Raina had to adjust his position and check the scope settings. Wind call, he said after a moment, his voice crisp and professional. 9 miles per hour northwest, gusting to 13, Frost replied. Be advised, conditions have shifted slightly since the previous shot. Halverson made his adjustments, taking his time. It was good shooting discipline, Raina could see that. He wasn't rushing, wasn't letting emotion drive his timing. Whatever else he might be, he was a trained professional who understood the fundamentals. But understanding and embodying were different things. Technical knowledge could take you far, but there was something beyond technique, something that came from thousands of hours of practice until the rifle became an extension of your body rather than a tool you wielded. Sending, Halverson announced, and the Barrett's report echoed across the valley again. Through her borrowed binoculars, Raina watched the impact point. The bullet struck low and right, missing the silhouette by perhaps 3 meters. At that distance, 3 meters was actually respectable shooting, well within what would be considered effective fire in actual combat conditions. But it wasn't the center mass hit that she'd achieved, and everyone present understood the difference. Impact low right, Frost called, approximately 3 meters from target center. Halverson cleared the weapon and stood up, his face carefully neutral. It was good shooting by any objective standard, but in the context of what had just happened, it felt like vindication of something none of them wanted to say aloud. He turned to face Raina directly, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the cold mountain air. That was exceptional shooting, Captain, he said finally, and the words sounded like they cost him something to produce. I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on factors that had nothing to do with actual competence. That was unprofessional and unfair. The apology hung between them, genuine despite its difficulty. Reyna could have savored it, could have let him twist a bit longer in his embarrassment. Instead, she simply nodded once, accepting it without ceremony. "We all make assumptions, Commander," she said quietly. "The important thing is what we do when they're proven wrong." She let a small smile touch her lips. "Besides, you made a solid shot. 3 meters at that distance is nothing to dismiss." It was generous, perhaps more generous than he deserved, but Reyna had learned long ago that grace and victory made stronger allies than gloating ever could. The convoy back to base was quieter than the ride out, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the anticipatory tension of earlier, but something more contemplative, as if everyone was processing what they'd witnessed and what it meant. Reyna sat in the same seat as before, watching the mountains slide past in reverse, the shadows lengthening as afternoon moved toward evening. Iris hadn't stopped grinning since they'd loaded into the vehicles. She kept glancing at Reyna with an expression that mixed pride and vindication and barely suppressed laughter. Finally, when they were halfway down the mountain, she leaned close enough that her voice wouldn't carry over the engine noise. "I wish I could have taken a picture of Halverson's face," she said quietly. "That moment when Kovacs confirmed the hit. I've never seen someone's entire worldview crumble in real time before." Reyna allowed herself a small smile. "He's not a bad person," she said. "Just someone who'd been taught to see the world a certain way. Sometimes the only thing that changes a person's perspective is direct experience." "Still," Iris said, leaning back with satisfaction evident in every line of her body. "Still, that was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful." Through the windshield of the vehicle ahead, Reyna could see the SEALs in conversation. Their body language had changed since the morning. Less swagger, more thoughtfulness. Occasionally one of them would glance back toward her vehicle, and the looks weren't dismissive anymore. They were evaluating, reassessing, possibly even respectful. The debriefing was scheduled for 1800 hours, which gave everyone time to clean up and file initial reports. Reyna spent the intervening hours in her unit's workspace, helping Iris and the other engineers inventory equipment and update training logs. It was familiar work, routine and calming after the intensity of the afternoon. Her hands knew these tasks well enough that her mind could wander. She thought about her grandfather, about how he would have reacted to today's events. He'd never been one for boasting or showmanship. When people asked him about his championship titles, he'd change the subject or deflect with humor. The medals were stored in a box in his closet, not displayed on walls. What mattered to him wasn't recognition, but the doing itself, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd mastered something difficult. "You thinking about him?" Iris asked, looking up from a logistics report. "Always," Reyna said simply. "Everything I do with a rifle, he's there in some way. His voice, his lessons, his patience." She paused, weighing words. "I think he would have been proud today, not of the shot itself, but of how I handled what came after." He always said that how you carry success tells more about your character than how you handle failure. Iris nodded slowly. "He sounds like he was a good man." "The best," Reyna agreed. "He died 3 years ago. Heart attack, while mending fence on the ranch. Quick and clean, which is how he would have wanted it. But I still catch myself thinking about what he'd say about things, what advice he'd give. Some people leave such a mark on you that they never really go away." The conversation drifted to other topics, practical concerns about the next phase of training and upcoming deployment schedules. But the memory of Clayton Caldwell lingered in Reyna's mind like wood smoke, present and pervasive even when not directly observed. The debriefing room was crowded when she arrived at 17:55, deliberately early enough to be present, but not so early as to seem overeager. The space was set up with chairs arranged in rough rows, facing a podium and projection screen. Officers from all the participating units were present, along with senior enlisted personnel and the range staff who'd witnessed the afternoon's events. Colonel Thornton entered at precisely 1800 hours, followed by Sergeant Major Kovacs, carrying a tablet and several folders. Halverson and his team were already seated near the front, and Reyna noticed the SEAL commander's posture was more subdued than it had been that morning. Not defeated, but definitely more thoughtful, more measured. Today's exercise produced several valuable lessons. Thornton began without preamble. He pulled up the first slide, showing ballistic data and range conditions. We successfully demonstrated precision engagement at distances that pushed the boundaries of conventional military capability. More importantly, we identified skill sets within our ranks that might otherwise have gone unrecognized and unutilized. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a diagram of the shot sequence, trajectory analysis, and impact documentation. Captain Caldwell's successful engagement at 2,950 meters represents exceptional marksmanship by any standard. The shot was executed under challenging conditions with equipment she'd never previously handled, demonstrating adaptability and technical mastery that exceed normal expectations. Raina felt dozens of eyes turned toward her, but she kept her gaze forward, her expression neutral and professional. Thornton was documenting the achievement for training records, making it official rather than anecdotal. She appreciated the recognition while simultaneously feeling uncomfortable with the attention it brought. Commander Halverson, Thornton continued, also demonstrated solid long-range shooting fundamentals, achieving effective fire at the same extreme distance. Both shooters showed the kind of capability we need to identify and develop across our forces. He paused, letting that sink in. The question this raises is how many other personnel have skills we're not utilizing because we haven't asked the right questions or provided the right opportunities. It was a pointed observation, delivered with the authority of rank and experience. Several officers shifted in their seats, possibly running mental inventories of their own units, wondering what capabilities they might be overlooking. Sergeant Major Kovacs, Thornton said, pulling a folder from the stack. Could you walk us through the technical analysis of today's shots? Kovacs stood and moved to the podium with the economical movements of a career professional. Sir, the conditions today were favorable but not ideal. Wind was variable between 8 and 15 miles per hour. Temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and we had approximately 60% humidity. The target distance of 2,950 meters with an elevation difference of 120 meters above the firing position creates significant ballistic challenges. He clicked through several slides showing trajectory calculations and atmospheric effects. At this distance, bullet drop is approximately 76 meters. Wind drift at 10 miles per hour would be roughly 6 meters. Time of flight is 3.8 seconds. During which the Earth's rotation creates additional drift through the Coriolis effect. Successfully engaging this target requires not just technical knowledge, but an almost intuitive understanding of how these factors interact. The room was silent, except for Kovacs' voice and the soft click of the presentation advancing. Raina found herself studying the data with professional interest, seeing her shot broken down into component parts and analyzed. It was strange seeing something she'd done largely by feel and experience reduced to numbers and charts, but it was also validating in a way. The math confirmed what her instincts had told her. Captain Caldwell, Kovacs continued, demonstrated several techniques that indicate extensive training beyond standard military curriculum. Her pre-shot routine included wind reading at multiple distances, atmospheric assessment, and timing patterns that suggest sophisticated understanding of ballistic principles. He looked directly at her. Ma'am, if you're willing, it would be valuable for the group to hear about your training background and methodology. It wasn't quite in order, but coming from Thornton's right hand during an official debrief, it carried weight. Raina stood smoothly, moving to the front of the room with the same calm deliberation she brought to most things. She was aware of the audience, aware particularly of Halverson and his team watching with focused attention. My grandfather was Clayton Caldwell. She began simply. Some of you may know the name from competitive shooting circles. He won the National 1,000-Yard Championship 3 times in the 1970s and 80s. He was also a rancher in Montana, and he believed that long-range shooting was both an art and a practical skill. She paused, organizing her thoughts. He started teaching me when I was 12. We'd spend entire days on the ranch, shooting at targets from 600 to 2,000 meters. He taught me to read wind by watching grass and dust, to judge temperature effects by feel, to understand that every shot was a conversation between you and the environment. He never used the word instinct. He said that what people call instinct is just pattern recognition developed through thousands of repetitions. Several people in the room were nodding now, recognizing the description of deep expertise developed over time. Raina continued, her voice steady and clear. By the time I was 16, I could make consistent hits at 1,500 meters. By 18, I'd pushed that to 2,000. When I graduated high school, I had scholarship offers for competitive shooting. She smiled slightly. But I wanted to serve. I wanted to be more than a person who could shoot well. So I joined the Marines and became a combat engineer. And you never mentioned this background, a major from the Ranger unit said, his tone curious rather than accusatory. And all your time in service? Raina shook her head. I didn't see how it was relevant to my job. Combat engineers focus on mobility, counter-mobility, and survivability operations. My shooting background didn't change my ability to clear obstacles or emplace charges. It was part of who I'd been, not necessarily who I was trying to be. But today, Thornton said, quietly, you chose to demonstrate those skills. Why? Raina looked at the colonel, understanding what he was really asking. Because you asked, sir, and because sometimes the best way to challenge assumptions is through demonstration rather than argument. She glanced at Halverson. No disrespect to Commander Halverson, but his team had already decided what I was capable of before I'd ever touched a rifle. Words wouldn't have changed that assessment. Performance did. The room was very quiet now, everyone absorbing the implications of what she'd said. It wasn't just about shooting or gender or military specialties. It was about how people formed judgments and what it took to change them. The memory came unbidden that night, sharp and clear as mountain air. Raina lay in her bunk in the temporary barracks, listening to the sounds of other Marines settling in for sleep, but her mind was back in Montana, back to a specific day that had shaped everything that followed. She'd been 15, gangly and self-conscious in the way teenagers often were, still growing into a body that seemed to change dimensions every few months. It was late summer, the kind of day when heat shimmered off the prairie and made distances hard to judge. Her grandfather had driven them out to the far edge of the ranch, where the land rolled away toward mountains that looked like they'd been painted on the sky. Today we're going to talk about failure, he'd said, setting up targets at 1,200 meters. Not the kind where you miss and try again. The kind where you miss and everyone's watching. The kind that makes you want to quit. Raina had looked at him with confusion. She'd been shooting well that summer, making consistent hits at distances that impressed even experienced shooters. Why are we talking about failure when I'm doing good? She'd asked. Clayton had smiled, that patient expression he wore when he was about to teach something important. Because right now, success comes easy to you. You're talented, you practice hard, and the shots are falling where you want them. But someday, maybe soon, you're going to face a situation where everything's on the line and people expect you to fail. You need to know how to handle that before it happens. He'd set up the scenario carefully, invited several of his shooting buddies from town, men who didn't know Raina well, and who'd made it clear they thought a teenage girl had no business attempting serious long-range shooting. They'd watched with barely concealed skepticism as Clayton explained that Raina would attempt 5 shots at 1,200 meters, and that he'd bet each of them $50 she'd put at least 4 of them in the center ring. The pressure had been enormous, amplified by adolescent self-consciousness and the weight of her grandfather's reputation riding on her performance. She remembered settling behind the rifle, feeling the men's eyes on her back like physical weight. The first shot had been good, center mass. The second had clipped the edge of the ring, technically a hit, but not impressive. The third had been a complete miss, sailing high and right by at least 2 meters. She'd felt panic rising then, felt the familiar spiral of self-doubt that came when performance didn't match expectations. Her breathing had become irregular, her hands slightly shaky. She'd been acutely aware of the whispers behind her, the knowing looks the men were probably exchanging. Of course the girl couldn't handle pressure. Of course Clayton's faith was misplaced. Her grandfather had called a break then, walked over and knelt beside her while the men talked among themselves. He hadn't offered comfort or excuses. Instead, he'd asked a simple question. Are you shooting for them or for yourself? The question had cut through her panic like a knife. For you, she'd admitted. I don't want to embarrass you. Clayton had shaken his head slowly. Raina girl, I'm not embarrassed by your shooting. I'm only embarrassed if you let other people's opinions change who you are. Those men back there, they've already decided what they think about you. Your next 2 shots won't change that, but they'll tell you something about yourself. They'll tell you if you're the kind of person who folds under pressure or the kind who gets steadier when it matters most. He'd stood up then, ready to walk back to the observers. One more thing, he'd said quietly. I didn't bet on you because I needed the money. I bet on you because I wanted you to know that I believe in you even when you're struggling. Especially when you're struggling. Raina had taken the next 2 shots with completely different mindset. She wasn't shooting to prove anything to the men watching. She wasn't shooting to validate her grandfather's bet. She was shooting because this was what she did, who she was, and other people's opinions didn't change the fundamentals of wind and distance and trigger press. Both shots had been perfect, dead center in the ring. Clayton had collected his money without gloating. But on the drive home, he'd said something that Raina still carried with her. Today wasn't about making those shots, he'd said. Today was about learning that you can. That when everything feels impossible and everyone expects you to fail, you have something inside you that gets stronger, not weaker. That's not a shooting skill. That's a life skill. The memory faded as someone down the barracks coughed in their sleep, bringing Raina back to the present. She understood now, years later, why her grandfather had engineered that situation. He'd been preparing her for exactly what had happened today at the range. He'd known that talent wasn't enough, that eventually she'd face moments where her abilities would be doubted, where she'd need to perform under the weight of everyone's assumptions. The next morning brought a different atmosphere to the training area. Word had spread beyond just the people who'd been present at the range. Raina noticed it in the way other service members looked at her, with curiosity rather than dismissal, with interest rather than skepticism. Several people she didn't know nodded respectfully as she passed. A female Army lieutenant approached her during breakfast with questions about shooting technique and training methodology. But the most significant change was in Halverson's team. The SEALs no longer moved through the training area like they owned it. There was a new carefulness in how they interacted with other units, particularly with the female service members. Frost sought Raina out during the morning briefing, approaching with genuine interest rather than the professional courtesy that had characterized their interaction as spotter. Ma'am, he said quietly, I wanted to apologize for my team's behavior yesterday morning. I should have said something, should have pushed back against the assumptions we were making. That was a failure of leadership on my part. Raina studied him for a moment. Frost was probably in his early 30s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent considerable time deployed in harsh environments. His eyes were steady, his apology genuine. You were in a difficult position, Chief, she said. Standing up to your commander and teammates takes courage. That's not an excuse, Frost replied. I've been on the teams for 8 years. I've seen this pattern before, where we dismiss people based on surface judgments. Yesterday was a reminder that I've been part of the problem. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. For what it's worth, that was the most impressive shooting I've ever witnessed. The way you read conditions, the patience you showed. That wasn't just skill. That was mastery. Thank you, Raina said simply. She appreciated the acknowledgement, but was also aware that too much focus on the shooting itself missed the larger point. The shot was important, but what it represented was more important. It was a challenge to assumptions, a demonstration that capability existed in unexpected places, that judging people by their demographic categories rather than their actual abilities was both unfair and counterproductive. The day's training scenarios were different from the previous day's activities. Less competitive, more collaborative. The SEALs worked alongside the Marines and Army Rangers with noticeably less swagger and more genuine professionalism. Halverson had apparently had conversations with his team because their interactions with other units showed respect rather than condescension. During a break in the afternoon, Reyna found herself standing near the equipment area, checking demolition charges for the next training evolution. Halverson approached alone, without his usual entourage, his hands shoved in his pockets in an almost self-conscious gesture. "Captain," he said by way of greeting. "Mind if I ask you something?" Reyna straightened, giving him her attention. "Go ahead, Commander." Halverson seemed to struggle with how to phrase his question. "Yesterday, when I was being—" He paused, searching for the right word. "When I was being an ass, you didn't react. You didn't get angry or defensive. You just stayed calm and did your job. How do you do that? How do you not let other people's prejudices get to you?" It was a surprisingly vulnerable question, particularly coming from someone who'd been so confident just a day earlier. Reyna considered it carefully before responding. "I do let it get to me," she said honestly. "It bothers me when people make assumptions about what I can or can't do based on anything other than actual performance. But my grandfather taught me that anger is a luxury you can't afford when you're trying to perform at your best. He said that every bit of energy you spend on resentment is energy you're taking away from excellence." Halverson nodded slowly, processing this. "So you channel it differently. Use it as motivation rather than letting it become distraction." "Something like that," Reyna agreed. "Plus," she added with a slight smile, "there's a certain satisfaction in letting your performance speak for itself. Words can be argued with. Results are harder to dismiss." A ghost of a smile crossed Halverson's face. "I noticed that yesterday. You didn't defend yourself or argue when I was questioning your capabilities. You just went out and made a shot that most trained snipers couldn't make. That was more effective than any argument would have been." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching other personnel move through their training evolutions. The mountains rose in the distance, snow-capped and eternal, indifferent to the human dramas playing out at their feet. "I've been thinking about what Colonel Thornton said," Halverson continued, "about how many people have capabilities we're not utilizing because we haven't asked the right questions." He turned to look at Reyna directly. "I've been leading men for 10 years, and I'm realizing now how many opportunities one might have missed because I was too focused on what I expected to see rather than what was actually there." "That's a hard realization to come to," Reyna said quietly. "But it's also the beginning of being a better leader." Halverson's expression suggested he was still working through that process, still reconciling his previous certainties with new understanding. "Thank you for that lesson, Captain. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary." He offered a slight nod and moved away, leaving Reyna alone with her equipment and her thoughts. The final training evolution was scheduled for the next afternoon, a complex scenario that would integrate all the participating units into a single coordinated operation. Colonel Thornton had designed it to be challenging, requiring precise timing and communication across multiple specialties. The morning was devoted to planning and rehearsals, giving each unit time to understand their role in the larger mission. Reyna sat in the operations tent with her engineering team, reviewing demolition placement diagrams and timeline calculations. The scenario called for her unit to breach 2 separate obstacles while other elements provided security and overwatch. It was exactly the kind of operation they trained for, complicated but achievable with proper coordination. "Captain Caldwell," a voice called from the tent entrance. She looked up to find a young Marine corporal she didn't recognize, holding a tablet. "Ma'am, Colonel Thornton requests your presence in the command section. Something about adjusting the operation plan." Reyna exchanged a glance with Iris, who shrugged to indicate she had no more information than Reyna did. "Copy that," Reyna replied, standing and brushing dust from her uniform. "Iris, keep working on the breach timeline. I'll be back shortly." The command section occupied a larger tent on the far side of the compound, where senior leadership coordinated overall training activities. When Reyna entered, she found Thornton standing with Halverson and several other officers, all of them studying a topographical map spread across a planning table. "Ah, Captain," Thornton said, looking up as she approached. "Thank you for coming. We've been discussing an addition to tomorrow's scenario, and I wanted your input before we finalize the plan." Reyna moved closer to the table, her eyes automatically scanning the map to understand the terrain and operational layout. "Yes, sir," she said. "What kind of addition are we considering?" Thornton gestured to a position marked on the map, far from the main operational area. Intelligence in this scenario indicates a high-value target located here, approximately 2,800 meters from our nearest observation post. The target represents an enemy commander coordinating defensive forces. Neutralizing this individual would significantly degrade enemy capability and affect the overall mission success. Reyna understood immediately where this was heading, but she waited for Thornton to continue rather than jumping to conclusions. The colonel exchanged a glance with Halverson before going on. "Commander Halverson and I have been discussing how to approach this element of the scenario," Thornton said. "Given the distance and the importance of the shot, we need someone with proven capability at extreme range." He looked directly at Reyna. "We'd like you to serve as the precision shooter for this evolution." The request hung in the air for a moment. Reyna was aware of the other officers watching her, aware that this was both an opportunity and a test of a different kind. Yesterday's shot had been impressive, but also low stakes. A training demonstration with no consequences beyond personal embarrassment if she'd failed. This was different. This was integrating her into the actual operational plan, making her shooting ability a critical element of mission success. "Sir," she said carefully, "I'm a combat engineer. My team needs me for the breach operations. Taking me out of that role might compromise our primary mission." "Your engineering team is well-trained and welled," Thornton replied. "Staff Sergeant Ketterman can manage the breaches. This is about utilizing the right capabilities in the right places. Would you be comfortable taking the shot?" It was phrased as a question, but Reyna understood the subtext. This was about more than just one training scenario. It was about whether she was willing to step outside her defined role when the situation called for capabilities that existed beyond her official specialty. It was about flexibility and adaptability and being willing to contribute wherever she was most needed. "Yes, sir," she said after a moment. "I'd be comfortable attempting the shot, but I want to coordinate closely with the security element and have a solid spotter. 2,800 meters in a dynamic scenario is more complicated than a static range shot." "Agreed," Halverson said, speaking for the first time. "I'd like Chief Frost to serve as your spotter, if you're amenable. He performed well in that role yesterday, and he understands how to read conditions for extreme-range shooting." Reyna nodded. Chief Frost would be excellent. She studied the map more carefully, noting elevation changes and potential wind patterns. "We'll need to position early, probably an hour before the main operation begins. Get a solid read on conditions before we're committed to the timeline." The planning session continued for another hour, working through details and contingencies. Reyna found herself impressed by how thoroughly Halverson engaged with the planning process. He asked intelligent questions, offered useful suggestions, and deferred to her expertise on ballistic considerations without any hint of the condescension that had characterized their first interactions. It was a remarkable transformation, accomplished in less than 48 hours. When a meeting broke up, Halverson walked with her back toward the main compound. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, and Reyna could smell snow on the wind, even though the sky remained clear. "I wanted you to know," Halverson said as they walked, "that recommending you for this role wasn't about trying to make amends for yesterday. It's because you're genuinely the best option for this shot. Politics and appearances aside, you've demonstrated capability that exceeds anyone else available." "I appreciate that, Commander," Reyna replied. "And for what it's worth, I think you're handling this situation with more grace than a lot of people would. Admitting you were wrong isn't easy, especially in front of your team." Halverson was quiet for a moment, his boots crunching on gravel. "My father was a SEAL," he said finally. 3 decades in the teams, multiple deployments, the whole career. He taught me a lot about tactics and leadership and discipline. But he also taught me some things that I'm realizing now were limitations disguised as wisdom." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "He would have handled yesterday's situation very differently than I'm handling it now. He would have doubled down, found excuses, protected his ego instead of learning from the experience. And you're choosing a different path, Reyna observed. Trying to? Halverson agreed. Your shot yesterday was humbling, but what struck me more was how you conducted yourself afterward. No lo ating, no triunfalismo. You could have made me look much worse than I already made myself look, but you didn't. That showed more character than the shooting did. They'd reached the split where their paths diverged, Halverson toward the SEAL compound and Reyna toward her unit's area. The SEAL commander stopped, turning to face her directly. Tomorrow's going to be challenging, he said, but I'm glad you're part of the team. I'm glad Colonel Thornton is giving us all a chance to get this right. Reyna offered a slight smile. We'll make it work, Commander. That's what we do. She watched him walk away, then turned toward her own unit's workspace. The mountains loomed in the distance, and somewhere out there was the position she'd occupy tomorrow, the place where she'd attempt another impossible shot, this time with mission success riding on her ability to perform under pressure. Iris was waiting when Reyna returned, her expression expectant. Well, she said without preamble. What did the colonel want? Reyna explained the plan, watching Iris's reaction shift from surprise to concern as something that might have been pride. So you're going to take the shot? Iris said when Reyna finished. Another long-range engagement, but this time it actually matters to the mission. This time it matters, Reyna agreed, which means I need to spend tonight preparing. Going over wind patterns in that area, understanding terrain effects, getting my head right for what's coming. You need me to do anything? Iris asked. Run scenarios, help with calculations, keep everyone else away, so you can focus? Just take care of the breach planning, Reyna said. Make sure the team knows I have complete confidence in your leadership. This operation succeeds or fails based on everyone doing their job well, not just on one shot. But the shot matters, Iris pressed. You know that, right? If you miss, the whole scenario potentially falls apart. Reyna met her friend's eyes steadily. If I miss, the team adapts and finds another way to accomplish the mission. That's what good units do. She paused, then smiled slightly. But I'm not planning to miss. That night, alone in the quiet darkness of the barracks, Reyna lay awake running through mental rehearsals. Not just the mechanical aspects of a shot, though those were important. She was preparing mentally and emotionally for what tomorrow would bring. The pressure will be different from yesterday's range demonstration. More people depending on her, more variables outside her control, more ways for things to go wrong. But she'd been preparing for this her whole life, really. Every shot on the Montana ranch with her grandfather watching patiently. Every lesson about reading wind and managing pressure and trusting the process. Every hour spent learning that excellence wasn't about never feeling doubt or fear, but about performing despite those feelings, about maintaining focus when everything else was chaos. She thought about what her grandfather would say if he could see her now. Probably something simple and direct, without unnecessary sentiment. He'd been a man of few words, preferring to teach through demonstration and experience rather than lectures. But she could almost hear his voice in the darkness, that patient Montana drawl that had shaped so much of who she'd become. The rifle's just a tool, Reyna girl. You're the weapon. Your mind, your discipline, your willingness to do what needs doing when it needs doing. Everything else is just details. Tomorrow would bring those details into sharp focus. Wind speed and direction, atmospheric conditions, distance calculations, timing requirements. But underneath all the technical considerations was something simpler and more fundamental. The willingness to take responsibility, to step forward when needed, to trust in preparation and training, and a quiet voice that said she was ready. She fell asleep finally, her breathing slow and steady, her mind calm despite the challenges ahead. Outside, the Washington night deepened toward morning, and the mountains waited in patient silence. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning where breath turned to vapor and metal burned cold enough to freeze skin on contact. Reyna had been awake for an hour already, going through her pre-mission routine with a methodical precision that separated professionals from amateurs. Equipment check, weapons maintenance, mental rehearsal. Each step completed with full attention, nothing rushed or overlooked. The Barrett M107A1 had been cleaned and prepped the night before, but she checked it again anyway. Bolt operation smooth, scope mount secure, barrel clean. The rifle was a beautiful piece of engineering, and treating it with respect was both practical necessity and professional courtesy to the weapon that would carry her intent across 2,800 meters of mountain air. Chief Frost arrived at Ofavethity, carrying his spotting scope and range-finding equipment. His face was alert despite the early hour, his movements efficient and purposeful. "Morning, ma'am," he said quietly. "Weather report shows favorable conditions. Wind steady between 6 and 9 miles per hour. Temperature rising to 42 degrees by operational start time. Visibility unlimited." "Good," Reyna replied, securing the last of her gear. "We'll move to position at 0600. I want at least 90 minutes to read conditions before we're on the timeline." They loaded into a vehicle with 3 other SEALs who would provide security for the shooting position. The drive through pre-dawn darkness was quiet, everyone focused on their individual preparations. Reyna watched the landscape emerge from shadow as light gradually filled the eastern sky, revealing terrain she'd studied on maps but was now seeing with her own eyes. The shooting position was a natural overlook on a ridgeline, offering clear sight lines across the valley to the target area. The security team spread out to establish a perimeter while Reyna and Frost began setting up the shooting platform. They worked together with the smooth efficiency of people who understood their roles, minimal conversation needed. By 0630, they were established, and Reyna settled behind the Barrett to begin her environmental assessment. This was the crucial part that most people didn't understand about long-range shooting. The actual trigger press took a fraction of a second. The hours of preparation before that moment determined whether the shot succeeded or failed. She watched the way grass moved at different distances, how flags on distant positions responded to wind. She studied mirage patterns through the scope, reading heat shimmer like text in a familiar language. She felt temperature on her exposed skin, monitored how her own breathing responded to the altitude and exertion of the approach. All of it was data, pieces of information that would aggregate into understanding. "Wind's doing something interesting around 1,200 meters, Frost observed, watching through his spotting scope. "There's a terrain feature creating some turbulence, but it smooths out beyond that point." Reyna had noticed the same thing. The valley narrowed at that distance, forcing wind through a constriction that created unpredictable eddies. But past that bottleneck, the airflow became more laminar, more predictable. Her bullet would need to navigate through that turbulent zone, and she'd need to account for its effects while also calculating for the steadier wind beyond. "How's your data matching observed conditions?" she asked Frost, testing his analysis against her own. "Wind speed averaging 7.5 miles per hour based on vegetation movement," he replied. "Temperature 40 degrees and rising slowly. Atmospheric pressure stable." His voice carried the confidence of someone who knew his craft. "I'm calculating approximately 4.2 meters of wind drift at target distance, assuming steady conditions." Reyna ran her own calculations, comparing them to Frost's assessment. She came up with 4.4 meters, close enough that the difference likely reflected rounding variations rather than fundamental disagreement. "Split the difference," she said. 4.3 meters, adjusted for that turbulent zone at 1,200. The radio crackled softly. "All elements. This is actual. Operational timeline begins in 60 minutes. Stand by for Phase 1 initiation." Colonel Thornton's voice was calm and professional, carrying the authority of command without unnecessary drama. Around the valley, various units would be moving into their assault positions, preparing for the coordinated operation that would test everything they trained for. Reyna continued her observation, letting her mind settle into that focused state where time became elastic and awareness heightened. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips where they rested lightly on the rifle, could track the pattern of her breathing, could sense the way her body weight distributed through the shooting platform. These were the kinds of details that mattered at extreme range, where the smallest inconsistency could translate to meters of error at the target. A memory surfaced without invitation. She was 17, preparing for her first competitive shooting match. Her grandfather had driven her to the range before dawn, and they'd gone through this same ritual of preparation and observation. She'd been nervous, worried about performing in front of experienced competitors, aware of how young and inexperienced she appeared. Pressure's just information, her grandfather had said, while she fretted about the upcoming match. It tells you that what you're doing matters, that there are stakes involved, but it doesn't change the fundamentals. Wind still moves the same way whether you're nervous or calm. The bullet still follows the same physics. You still know how to read conditions and make the shot. So use the pressure to sharpen your focus, but don't let it change your process. She'd won that match, shooting against men twice her age with decades more experience. Not because she was more talented or better equipped, but because she'd trusted her preparation and executed her process without letting external pressure distort her judgment. "Ma'am," Frost said quietly, pulling her back to the present. "Target area is active. I have visual on opposition force personnel moving through the compound." Reyna shifted her scope to observe the target area. Through the powerful magnification, she could see figures moving between buildings, going about the scripted activities that simulated enemy operations. Somewhere among those buildings would be her target, the high-value individual whose elimination would trigger the next phase of the operation. "All elements, stand by," Thornton's voice came over the radio. "Phase 1 initiating in 5 minutes. Reyna took a deep breath, settling her position fractionally. Her body knew this stance from 10,000 repetitions, knew exactly how much tension to maintain and where to release it. The rifle became an extension of her skeleton, supported by bone structure rather than muscle tension. It was a position she could hold for hours if necessary, stable and sustainable. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. She could hear the security element shifting position behind her, could hear Frost's steady breathing beside her, could hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears. But mostly she heard the wind, that constant presence that would determine everything about the shot to come. "Phase 1 execute," Thornton announced, and immediately the valley erupted with simulated combat noise. Blank rounds fired, smoke grenades deployed, vehicles moving into assault positions. The choreographed chaos of military operations at full tempo. Through her scope, Reyna watched the target compound react to the assault. Personnel scrambling, taking defensive positions, responding to the threat exactly as the scenario predicted they would. And then she saw him, the target, a figure in different uniform moving from one building to another, clearly directing the defensive response. "Target identified," she said calmly into her radio. "Building 3 to Building 5, moving east. Dark jacket command behavior." "Confirmed visual," Frost replied, his spotting scope tracking the same individual. "Range 2815 meters. Wind 7 miles per hour, steady northwest. Target is mobile. Estimate 15-second window before he reaches cover." Reyna's mind processed the information instantaneously. 2815 meters meant slightly different calculations than the 2800 she'd been preparing for. The target was moving, which added another variable. 15 seconds was plenty of time, but only if she committed immediately and trusted her first read of conditions. The target moved with purposeful urgency, clearly trying to reach the safety of Building 5, where he could continue coordinating the defense. Reyna tracked him through her scope, leading him slightly, calculating not where he was but where he would be when the bullet arrived 4 seconds after leaving the barrel. Everything her grandfather had taught her compressed into this single moment. The years of practice, the lessons about wind and patience and pressure. The understanding that at this distance, the shot wasn't about precision aiming, but about trusting your calculations and your instincts synthesized into a single decision. She could feel the wind on her left cheek, steady and cool. Could see it in the grass movement at various ranges. Could read it in the mirage and the flags and the way smoke drifted from the simulated explosions. All of it told the same story. 7 miles per hour northwest, with that turbulent section at 1,200 meters that would push the bullet slightly before it recovered into steadier air. Target reaching Building 5 in 10 seconds, Frost called. 9, 8. Reyna's finger found the trigger, taking up the slack with practiced precision. Her breathing had slowed to almost nothing, her heartbeat steady and calm. The target moved across her scope's field of view with predictable trajectory. She led him by what felt like an impossible amount. The reticle aimed at empty space ahead of his movement. 7 seconds. She exhaled half a breath and held it, finding that perfect stillness between breaths where the body settled into absolute stability. The trigger's break point waited under her finger, familiar and certain. Every factor had been calculated, every variable accounted for. Now it was just commitment and execution. 6 seconds. The world compressed into perfect clarity. Target movement, wind direction, distance calculation, bullet trajectory. All of it existed simultaneously in her awareness, a complete picture of the ballistic problem and its solution. 5 seconds. Trust the process, her grandfather's voice whispered in memory. Trust your preparation. Trust yourself. For seconds. Sending, she said calmly, and pressed the trigger through its break point with smooth inevitability. The Barrett's massive report echoed across the valley like a physical force, rolling off ridgelines and bouncing between rock faces until it seemed the entire world had heard the shot. The recoil drove back into Reyna's shoulder with familiar authority, the muzzle brake redirecting gases in a violent bloom that kicked up dust around the shooting position. Through her scope, she watched the target continue his movement for a fraction of a second, momentum carrying him forward even as the universe caught up to him. And then the paint round struck. At this distance, the impact looked almost gentle, a small burst of colored marking compound blooming on the target's center mass. But Reyna knew the reality. In actual combat, that would have been a .50 caliber projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to be instantly catastrophic. The target dropped immediately, following the scenario protocols for a confirmed hit, his body language broadcasting defeat even through the chaos of the ongoing exercise. Hit, Frost called, his voice carrying professional satisfaction. Center mass, target down. Time of flight, 3.9 seconds. That was perfect shooting, ma'am. Absolutely perfect. Through the radio came Colonel Thornton's voice, crisp and controlled despite what must have been significant surprise. Confirmed target neutralization. High-value individual is down. All elements proceed to Phase 2. The operation continued around them, other units moving through their assigned tasks now that the command element had been eliminated. Reyna could see Marines from her engineering team advancing toward their breach objectives, could see the Ranger element providing security, could see the entire choreographed complexity of modern military operations unfolding exactly as planned. But she remained focused on her own position, maintaining her shooting stance even though the immediate threat had been addressed. At this range, in this scenario, there could be follow-on targets that required engagement. Her job wasn't finished just because the primary shot had succeeded. Professional shooters maintained their position until released by command authority, ready for whatever came next. Outstanding work. Overlook. Thornton's voice came through her earpiece, using her position call sign. Maintain observation and report any high-priority targets. The scenario continues for another 30 minutes. Reyna acknowledged and settled deeper into her position, scanning through her scope with renewed focus. Beside her, Frost had his spotting scope up, covering a different sector, the two of them working together to maintain comprehensive observation of the operational area. The next half hour passed in professional routine, calling out position updates and movement reports as the scenario played out below them. It wasn't glamorous work, just steady observation and communication, but it was essential to the operation's success. Reyna found herself appreciating the rhythm of it, the way her role integrated seamlessly into the larger mission. When a scenario finally concluded, marked by a series of simulated explosions as her engineering team successfully breached their objectives, Reyna allowed herself to relax slightly. She cleared the Barrett's action, rendering it safe, and only then permitted herself to feel the satisfaction of a job well done. "That was one hell of a shot," one of the security team members said as they began breaking down the position. "Moving target at over 2,800 meters. I didn't think that was even possible." "Everything's possible with the right preparation and conditions," Raina replied, carefully packing the Barrett into its case. "Today we had good conditions and enough time to read them properly. Tomorrow might be different." "But you made it look easy," the SEAL insisted. "The way you tracked that target, the lead you gave him. That wasn't luck. That was skill." Raina acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod, but didn't elaborate. There was a fine line between accepting recognition and appearing to seek it, and she preferred to err on the side of humility. Her grandfather had taught her that good shooters let their performance speak for itself and didn't feel the need to explain or justify their capabilities. The convoy back to the main compound was celebratory in a subdued military way. Mission success always brought satisfaction, even in training scenarios where the stakes were artificial. Raina found herself fielding questions from the other personnel in the vehicle, people wanting to know about her training background and shooting methodology. She answered patiently, explaining concepts of wind reading and trajectory calculation, but she was also careful to emphasize the team aspects. The shot wouldn't have been possible without Chief Frost spotting, without the security element providing protection, without the overall operation creating the scenario where the target presented itself. Highlighting individual achievement at the expense of team contribution was poor form, and she knew it. The debriefing was scheduled for 1,500 hours, giving everyone time to clean up and file initial reports. When Raina entered the operations tent, she found it more crowded than the previous day's debrief. Word of the successful shot had spread, and now there were senior officers present who hadn't participated directly in the training but wanted to observe the after-action review. Captain Caldwell, Colonel Thornton began without preamble, his weathered face showing what might have been pride beneath the professional neutrality. "Your engagement of the high-value target was textbook perfect. Moving target at extreme range during active operations, with time constraints and coordination requirements. That represents the highest level of precision shooting capability." He pulled up footage that had been captured by observation drones, showing the shot from multiple angles. The assembled officers watched in silence as the video played, showing Raina's patient tracking, the moment of commitment, the bullet's flight time, and the perfect center mass impact just as the target reached what he thought was safety. "The mathematics of this shot are worth examining," Sergeant Major Kovacs said, standing to walk through the ballistic analysis. "At 2,815 meters, we're looking at significant bullet drop, wind drift, and time of flight considerations. But at a moving target, and the complexity increases exponentially." He clicked through slides showing trajectory calculations and lead requirements. Captain Caldwell had to aim roughly 8 meters ahead of the target's position to account for his movement during bullet flight. That requires not just technical knowledge, but an almost intuitive grasp of relative motion and timing. Raina sat quietly, letting the technical discussion happen around her. She appreciated that Kovacs was explaining the difficulty of what she'd accomplished, providing context that helped others understand the level of skill involved. But she also felt slightly uncomfortable with the extended focus on her individual performance. Chief Frost deserves equal recognition. She interjected when there was a pause in the presentation. His spotting and wind calls were flawless. Without accurate environmental data, the best shooting fundamentals in the world won't produce hits at this distance. "Agreed," Thornton said, nodding to Frost. "The shooter-spotter relationship is critical for extreme-range engagements." Both elements performed exceptionally today. The debrief continued for another hour, reviewing all aspects of the operation. Iris provided analysis of the breach operations, explaining how the elimination of the enemy commander had allowed her team to exploit confusion and achieve their objectives ahead of schedule. Halverson discussed the security element's performance, noting lessons learned about position selection and communication protocols. What impressed Raina most was how the conversation had evolved from yesterday's debrief. There was no longer an undercurrent of surprise or disbelief about her capabilities. Instead, there was professional analysis and recognition, the kind of discussion that focused on performance rather than demographics. It was a small shift, but significant in what it represented. When the formal debrief concluded, several officers approached Reyna with questions about training methodologies and skill development. A Marine colonel from a division headquarters asked about incorporating extreme range shooting into broader combat training. An Army major wanted to discuss how to identify hidden capabilities within existing personnel. She answered each question thoughtfully, but she was also aware of the risk of being pigeonholed as just a shooter defined by one capability rather than the full scope of her professional identity. She joined the Marines to be a combat engineer, and while the shooting had opened doors and changed perceptions, she didn't want it to become her only recognized attribute. "Captain," a quiet voice said behind her. She turned to find Colonel Thornton standing there, his expression more relaxed than she'd seen it during official proceedings. "Walk with me for a moment." They left the operations tent and moved toward the edge of the compound, where the ground sloped away toward the valley they'd operated in that morning. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm light, softening the harsh military geometry of the training facility. "You handled yourself well in there," Thornton said after a moment of companionable silence, both in the operation and in the debrief. "It's not easy being the center of attention, especially when that attention comes from demonstrating capability that challenges people's preconceptions." "Thank you, sir," Reyna replied. "I'm trying to balance recognition with team focus. This wasn't about me proving something. It was about accomplishing the mission." Thornton nodded slowly. "That's exactly the right attitude. But I want you to understand something, Captain. What you accomplished over the past 2 days goes beyond just good shooting. You changed minds. You forced people to reconsider assumptions they didn't even know they were making. That has value far beyond the immediate tactical success." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've been in the Corps for 30 years. I've seen a lot of change, some of it good and some of it necessary but difficult. One of the hardest changes to implement is changing how people think, how they evaluate capability and potential. You can issue all the directives you want about equal opportunity and merit-based assessment, but until people see actual performance that contradicts their assumptions, the directives remain abstract." "Sir," Reyna said carefully, "are you saying you set this whole situation up deliberately? The challenge at the range, putting me in the operational role?" Thornton's slight smile suggested she was close to the truth. "Let's just say I recognized an opportunity when I saw one. You had capabilities that weren't being fully utilized. Commander Halverson had assumptions that needed challenging, and this training exercise provided a context where both those factors could be addressed in a way that produced lasting lessons rather than temporary compliance." Reyna processed this, understanding now that the past 2 days had been more deliberately orchestrated than she'd realized. It didn't diminish her achievement, but it did reframe it slightly. She'd been participating in a teaching moment that extended beyond just her individual performance. "I hope you're not offended," Thornton continued. "You earned everything that happened through your own skill and preparation. I just provided the opportunity and the context." "Not offended, sir," Reyna said after a moment. "Actually, I'm grateful. My grandfather used to set up situations like this, scenarios where I'd have to perform under pressure with stakes that mattered. He said that's how you find out what you're really capable of." "Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man," Thornton observed. "He was," Reyna agreed quietly. "He really was." The final evening at Joint Base Lewis McChord carried a different energy than the previous nights. The training exercise was complete, objectives achieved, lessons learned and documented. Now came the informal part of military culture, where units gathered to decompress and share stories before dispersing back to their regular assignments. Someone had organized a barbecue near one of the recreation areas, grills smoking in the cooling evening air, while personnel from all the participating units mingled with the easy camaraderie that came after shared challenges. Reyna stood with Iris and several other Marines from her engineering team, nursing a soda and listening to conversations flow around her. The atmosphere had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. Female service members moved through the gathering with noticeably more confidence, their presence acknowledged rather than dismissed or overlooked. Several junior enlisted women had approached Reyna throughout the day, not asking for autographs or treating her like a celebrity, but simply expressing appreciation for what her performance represented. It had opened a door, proven a possibility, made space for others to imagine themselves in similar roles. Captain Caldwell, a voice called from nearby. She turned to find Halverson approaching with several of his SEAL team members, including Frost. The commander carried himself differently now, less swagger and more substance, as if the past few days had stripped away some performative layer to reveal something more genuine underneath. "Commander," Reyna acknowledged with a slight nod. "Chief, gentlemen." Halverson gestured to the gathering around them, the mixing of units and specialties that normally remained more segregated. "This is good," he said simply. "This is what joint operations should look like. Not just different branches working in proximity, but actually learning from each other, recognizing capability wherever it exists." "It's been an educational few days," Frost added with a slight smile. "I've learned more about my own assumptions in the past 72 hours than in the previous 8 years. One of the other SEALs, a younger operator whose name tape read Morrison, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize directly for some of the comments I made before the range day. I was repeating things I'd heard without thinking about what I was actually saying. That was unprofessional and wrong." Reyna studied the young SEAL for a moment. He couldn't have been more than 25, probably only a few years into his military career. His apology was genuine, carrying the awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to admitting mistakes. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "The fact that you're willing to reconsider your position says more about your character than the original assumption did." Morrison nodded, clearly relieved, and stepped back slightly. Halverson moved a bit closer, lowering his voice so the conversation became more private despite the surrounding crowd. "I spoke with my father yesterday," he said quietly. "Told him about what happened here." There was a long pause. He didn't take it well. Started talking about standards being lowered and political correctness compromising combat effectiveness. All the things I probably would have agreed with a week ago. "And now," Reyna prompted gently, "now I'm wondering how many other talented people I've dismissed or overlooked because I was seeing the world through his filters instead of my own eyes." Halverson's expression was troubled but thoughtful. "I'm 34 years old. At some point, I need to stop defaulting to my father's worldview and develop my own understanding based on actual experience." "That's harder than it sounds," Reyna observed, "especially when you respect the person whose views you're reconsidering." "He was a good SEAL," Halverson said. 3 decades of service, multiple deployments, genuine expertise in his field. But I'm realizing now that expertise in tactics doesn't automatically translate to wisdom about people. He might have been excellent at his job, while still being wrong about who could do that job." The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Thornton's arrival, the senior officer moving through the gathering with the easy authority of someone completely comfortable in his role. He carried a plate of barbecue and seemed determined to spend time circulating rather than holding court in one location. When he reached their group, he nodded to Halverson and his team before turning his attention to Reyna. "Captain, I wanted you to know that I've been contacted by several commands who heard about this week's training outcomes. There's significant interest in your shooting capabilities and how they might be utilized going forward." Reyna felt a slight tension form in her shoulders. "Sir, with all due respect, I'm a combat engineer. That's my specialty, my training, my career path. I don't want to be reassigned to a role that takes me away from my primary mission." Thornton held up a hand, forestalling further concern. "I'm not suggesting reassignment. What I'm suggesting is that we need to be smarter about identifying and utilizing the full range of capabilities that exist within our personnel. You're a combat engineer who also happens to be an exceptional marksman. Both those skill sets have value, and neither one negates the other." He took a bite of his barbecue, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. "The broader lesson here isn't about you specifically, Captain. It's about how we evaluate talent and capability across our forces. How many other people have skills we're not using because we've put them in narrow categories and never looked beyond the immediate job description? It was a rhetorical question, but Frost answered anyway. Probably more than we'd like to admit, sir. I've been in the teams for years, and I couldn't tell you what most of my teammates did before they enlisted or what capabilities they have outside their specific specialties. Exactly, Thornton said. We're getting better at talent management, but we still have a tendency to see people as their current role rather than their full potential. This exercise was partly about challenging that tendency. The evening continued with more mingling and conversation, stories shared and connections made. Raina found herself talking with an Army Ranger captain about engineering challenges in different terrain types, with a Marine gunny about advanced marksmanship training methodologies, with a Navy logistics officer about supply chain considerations for remote operations. Each conversation reinforced that her value extended beyond any single capability. Later, as the gathering began winding down and people drifted back toward their temporary quarters, Iris fell in a step beside Raina. You know this is going to follow you, she said quietly. This week, what you accomplished, it's going to be part of your reputation now, for better or worse. I know, Raina replied. I'm still processing what that means. It means people will have expectations, Iris continued. Some will expect you to be a symbol or a representative of something larger than yourself. Others will expect you to fail eventually, to prove that this week was an anomaly. She paused, her dark eyes serious in the fading light. How are you going to handle that? Raina considered the question carefully. The same way my grandfather taught me to handle pressure, she said finally. By focusing on the fundamentals and not letting other people's expectations change who I am or what I'm doing. The shot I made yesterday was the same shot I've made hundreds of times on the ranch. The only thing that changed was the context and the audience. And the stakes, Iris pointed out. And the stakes, Raina agreed. But the process remained the same. That's what I'm going to hold on to going forward. The process, the preparation, the fundamentals. Everything else is just noise. They walked in companionable silence for a moment, the sounds of the gathering fading behind them. The Washington night was cool and clear, stars beginning to emerge overhead despite the ambient light from the base facilities. For what it's worth, Iris said as they approached their barracks, I'm proud of you. Not just for the shooting, though that was incredible, but for how you handled everything around it. The recognition, the attention, the way you kept bringing focus back to the team and the mission. That showed leadership. Raina smiled slightly. I'll learn from the best, she said. You've been showing me what good leadership looks like for 2 deployments now. Iris laughed. I taught you how to set demolition charges under pressure and how to curse in 3 languages. The rest you brought with you. Inside the barracks, Raina began preparing her gear for the next day's departure. The training exercise was over, and tomorrow everyone would return to their regular assignments and duty stations. Life would resume its normal patterns, though perhaps with slightly shifted perspectives for those who participated in the past few days. She pulled out her phone and looked at the photo she kept as her wallpaper. Her grandfather, standing on the Montana ranch with his championship rifle, squinting into the sun with that patient expression she remembered so well. He'd been gone for 3 years, but she still felt his presence in moments like this, still heard his voice offering guidance and perspective. You did good, Raina girl, she imagined him saying, not just with the rifle, but with everything around it. You stayed true to who you are while still stepping up when needed. That's the balance that matters. She set the phone aside and finished packing, her movements efficient and practiced. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to serve. But tonight she could rest in the satisfaction of a job well done, a lesson taught, and a small shift in how people thought about capability and potential. The lights in the barracks dimmed as people settled in for sleep. Outside, the base continued its endless cycle of activity, never truly quiet, always preparing for whatever came next. And somewhere in the mountains beyond, the wind still moved through the valleys, patient and eternal, waiting for the next person who would learn to read its language and understand its secrets. Morning came with the organized chaos of military personnel preparing to depart, gear being loaded into vehicles, final equipment checks being conducted, units preparing to return to their home stations. Raina stood near the staging area with her engineering team, supervising the loading of their equipment while simultaneously fielding goodbyes and well wishes from people she'd worked with over the past few days. The transformation that had occurred was subtle but undeniable. Service members who'd ignored or dismissed her earlier in the week now sought her out for conversation, offered genuine respect, treated her as the competent professional she'd always been. It was gratifying in a way, but also tinged with irony. She was the same person she'd been 4 days ago, only their perception had changed. Captain Caldwell, a voice called from behind her. She turned to find Halverson approaching one final time, his SEAL team loading their own vehicles nearby. The commander carried himself with the same professional bearing as always, but something fundamental had shifted in how he occupied space. Less performance, more authenticity. "Commander," she acknowledged. "Safe travels back to your command." "Likewise," he replied. He hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his words. "I wanted to thank you before we departed. Not just for the shooting demonstration, though that was remarkable, but for handling the entire situation with more grace than I deserved. You could have made me look much worse than you did." "You made yourself look fine," Raina said simply. "You acknowledged your assumptions, adjusted your perspective, and moved forward. That's what good leaders do. The initial judgment was a mistake, but your response to being wrong showed character." Halverson nodded slowly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said during the debrief, about wanting to be judged on your service rather than your background. That resonated with me. I've spent my career trading on my father's reputation in some ways, using his legacy as a shortcut to credibility. Maybe it's time I establish my own identity based on my own choices and values." "That's a difficult transition," Raina observed, "but probably a necessary one." Chief Frost approached from the vehicle staging area, his gear already loaded. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Raina directly, "I want to say it's been an honor working with you. Best spotter-shooter experience I've had in my career. If you ever need someone to call wind for you, I'd be privileged to serve in that role again." The sentiment was genuine and touching. "Thank you, Chief. You're an exceptional spotter. Any shooter would be fortunate to work with someone of your caliber." Frost grinned slightly. High praise coming from someone who just made 2 of the most impressive shots I've ever witnessed. He shook her hand firmly. "Take care of yourself, Captain, and keep showing people what's possible." The SEALs departed shortly after, their convoy rolling out with typical efficiency. Raina watched them go, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. Halverson and his team had arrived with certainty about how the world worked and who belonged in which roles. They were leaving with questions, with reconsideration, with the beginning of different understanding. That was progress, even if it had required dramatic demonstration to initiate. Colonel Thornton found her as she was conducting final equipment checks. The senior officer looked satisfied in the way commanders did when training exercises accomplished their intended purposes. "Captain," he said without preamble, "I'll be submitting a formal commendation for your performance during this exercise, both for the precision shooting and for the professionalism you displayed throughout." "Sir, that's not necessary," Raina began, but Thornton cut her off with a raised hand. "It's absolutely necessary," he said firmly. "Not for your benefit, though you've earned recognition, but because documentation matters. It creates a record, establishes precedent, provides evidence that exceptional performance exists across demographics. The next time someone questions whether women can perform at the highest levels in combat specialties, there will be documented proof that challenges that assumption." Raina understood the logic even as she felt uncomfortable with the attention. "Sir," she said carefully, "I don't want to become a poster child or a symbol. I just want to do my job." "And you will," Thornton assured her. "But sometimes doing your job includes accepting recognition that serves purposes beyond individual acknowledgement. You've opened doors for other people, Captain. That has value worth documenting." He paused, his weathered face softening slightly. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, not just for the shooting, which was exceptional, but for how you carried yourself through this entire week." That's the mark of genuine character. The words hit deeper than Reyna expected. She felt emotion rise in her throat, unexpected and powerful. "Thank you, sir," she managed. "That means more than you know." Thornton nodded once, understanding passing between them that needed no further elaboration. Then he was moving on to other departing units, fulfilling his role as senior officer while still making personal connections that mattered. Iris appeared at Reyna's elbow as Thornton departed. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "You look like you just got hit with something heavy." "Just remembering what matters," Reyna replied, "and why we do what we do." Their own departure came an hour later, the engineering team's convoy forming up for the journey back to their home station. As they pulled away from Joint Base Lewis McChord, Reyna looked back at the mountains where she'd made those impossible shots, where she'd challenged assumptions and changed perceptions and honored the legacy her grandfather had built. The landscape rolled past the window, familiar Pacific Northwest terrain giving way to other regions as they traveled. Reyna pulled out her phone and looked again at the photo of her grandfather on the ranch. He stood there frozen in time, patient and solid, the rifle that had won 3 national championships held with casual expertise. She'd carried his lessons with her through everything. The patience to wait for the right moment. The discipline to maintain focus under pressure. The humility to let performance speak louder than words. The understanding that true excellence came from thousands of hours of practice, not from innate talent or fortunate circumstance. But she'd also added her own elements to his teaching. The willingness to step forward when needed. The grace to accept recognition without letting it define her identity. The understanding that sometimes making space for others required being visible yourself, even when visibility felt uncomfortable. The convoy continued its journey, miles falling away beneath the wheels. Around her, the other Marines in the vehicle talked and joked, the easy camaraderie of people who'd worked together through challenges and emerged successful. They treated her the same as they always had, as their captain and their leader, someone who'd proven herself long before this week's dramatic demonstrations. That was perhaps the most important outcome of the past few days. Not that she'd changed, but that she'd forced others to see what had been there all along. Capability, competence, dedication, and skill that existed independent of assumptions or categories or comfortable prejudices. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment and let us know your favorite part or character. Maybe you've had a similar experience where someone underestimated you based on appearances. We'd love to hear about it. Reyna's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down to see it was from her mother, who still lived on the Montana ranch where Reyna had grown up. "Just heard from Colonel Thornton about what happened this week. Your grandfather would have been so proud. I know I am. Come home when you can. The ranch misses you." Reyna typed a quick response, promising to visit during her next leave, then put the phone away. The ranch would still be there, the wind still moving through the valleys, the targets still waiting at impossible distances. It was a constant in her life, a place where she could return to fundamentals and remember what mattered beneath all the noise and attention. The convoy rolled on through changing landscape, carrying its cargo of personnel and equipment and lessons learned. Behind them, Joint Base Lewis McChord continued its mission, training the next generation of warriors, building capability, preparing for whatever challenges the future held. And somewhere in that future, there would be other people facing doubt and dismissal, other talents waiting to be recognized, other assumptions waiting to be challenged. The work was never finished, the lessons never completely learned. Each generation had to discover for themselves that capability existed everywhere, in everyone, if only people were willing to look beyond surface judgments and recognize excellence wherever it appeared. Reyna settled back in her seat, letting the motion of the vehicle and the conversation of her teammates wash over her. She was returning to her regular duties, to the daily work of a Marine combat engineer, to the challenges and responsibilities that had nothing to do with extreme-range shooting or dramatic demonstrations. But she carried something new with her now. Not fame or recognition, though those would follow in their own way. She carried the knowledge that she'd made a difference, had opened doors, had shown others what was possible when talent met opportunity and preparation met moment. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory one final time, that patient Montana drawl that had shaped so much of who she'd become. You can't control what other people think or believe, Raina girl. You can only control your own preparation, your own performance, your own character. Do those things right, and eventually the truth becomes undeniable. The truth had become undeniable over the past few days. And as the convoy carried her toward whatever came next, Raina knew she was ready for it, prepared by years of training and a legacy of excellence that she'd honored while also making her own. The mountains fell away behind them, but their lessons remained. And somewhere ahead, new challenges waited, new opportunities to serve, new moments when preparation and skill would matter more than assumptions or prejudice or comfortable certainties about who belonged where. She was ready. She'd always been ready. The world was just finally catching up to what her grandfather had known all along. That true capability recognized no boundaries except those imposed by fear and ignorance, and that excellence, when given the chance, would always rise to meet the moment. The convoy continued onward, carrying its precious cargo of warriors and lessons and possibilities toward whatever future waited beyond the horizon.